In the winter of 1379, a woman named Eleanor stood alone in a stone cell deep beneath a castle in northern France, listening to the sound of masons working above her. She had been 23 years old when they brought her here 6 days ago. She had been a nobleman's wife, educated, refined, accused of something she swore she had never done. For 6 days she had heard the sounds of construction, hammering, scraping, the voices of men working. On the 7th day, the sounds stopped. The door to her cell opened, and the masons entered, carrying buckets of mortar and stones. Eleanor asked them what they were doing. They would not answer. They began building a wall across the opening of her cell, sealing her inside. Eleanor screamed. She begged them to stop. She pleaded to speak to someone, anyone, to explain that this was a mistake, that she was innocent. The masons worked in silence, laying stone upon stone, mixing mortar, building the wall higher. As the wall rose to chest height, Eleanor could still see out into the corridor. She saw the castle steward watching from a distance. She called to him, reminded him that she had known him since childhood, begged him to stop this. He turned and walked away. The wall continued to rise. When it reached Eleanor's shoulders, she realized what was happening. They were sealing her in. They were burying her alive in this cell beneath the castle. She would die here in the darkness slowly alone, and no one would stop it because her husband had accused her of adultery, and in medieval Europe a husband's word was law. But before I tell you what happened to Eleanor in that sealed cell, before I tell you whether she survived or how long she lasted, before I reveal the full horror of what medieval society did to women accused of adultery, I need to tell you about other women whose fates were just as terrible, whose stories reveal a system of punishment so brutal that it's almost impossible to believe it happened in Christian Europe. Because what happened to Eleanor was not unique. It was one method among dozens that medieval courts and communities used to destroy women accused of betraying their husbands. And by the end of this video, when I tell you what ultimately happened to Eleanor in that cell, you will understand that medieval Europe's treatment of accused adulteresses was worse than execution, worse than torture, worse than anything most people can imagine. This is the story of the most horrific punishments for cheating wives in medieval Europe, and I need you to understand from the beginning that everything I describe is documented in historical records, in court documents, in church archives, in chronicles written by medieval people themselves. These are not legends or exaggerations, these are real punishments that happened to real women recorded by the very societies that carried them out. If you want to understand how entire civilizations can normalize systematic violence against women, how accusations become weapons more deadly than swords, how gender-based terror can be woven into the fabric of law and custom, then you need to watch this entire video. Subscribe to this channel right now because we are about to go deep into one of the darkest chapters of human history. Hit that subscribe button and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. Now let me tell you about Marjorie because her story shows you how these punishments actually worked in practice, and because what happened to her will help you understand what was waiting for Eleanor in that sealed cell. In the spring of 1342, a woman named Marjorie stood in the village square of a small town in Yorkshire, England, while the blacksmith heated an iron rod in his forge until it glowed orange-red with heat. Marjorie was 31 years old, married for 14 years to a wool merchant named Thomas who traveled frequently for business. She had been accused of adultery with a young baker named William. The evidence was circumstantial at best, almost laughably thin. A neighbor claimed to have seen William entering Marjorie's home while Thomas was away on one of his business trips. Another neighbor said she had heard laughter coming from inside the house. That was it. That was the entire case against Marjorie. A man entered her home during daylight hours, possibly to deliver bread. Someone heard laughter. From this, an entire community concluded that Marjorie was an adulteress who deserved punishment. Marjorie had not been allowed to defend herself in any meaningful way. She had not been permitted to speak at the trial held by the local Lord's Court. Her accuser was her husband Thomas himself, and under medieval law throughout most of Europe, a husband's testimony about his wife's behavior carried absolute weight. His word was truth, his interpretation of events was reality. Thomas had found out about William's visits through neighborhood gossip that had reached him while he was conducting business in another town. A fellow merchant had mentioned with smirking sympathy that people back home were talking about Thomas's wife entertaining the baker while Thomas was away. Thomas had not witnessed any impropriety himself. He had no evidence beyond the gossip, but the damage to his honor, the public humiliation of being potentially cuckolded, the whispers and knowing looks from other men, these demanded action. His reputation as a man depended entirely on his ability to control his wife, to ensure her absolute fidelity, to punish her publicly and severely if she strayed or even if she appeared to stray. In medieval society, a man who could not control his wife was not a man at all, he was a cuckold, a figure of mockery and contempt, someone who had failed at the most basic duty of manhood. Now Marjorie stood with her hands bound behind her back while the entire village gathered to watch her punishment. The gathering was not optional. The Lord's bailiff had gone through the village that morning announcing that all residents were required to attend the punishment of the adulteress Marjorie, wife of Thomas the wool merchant. Attendance was mandatory because these punishments were not just about punishing the individual, they were about teaching the entire community a lesson, about reinforcing social order, about showing every wife what would happen if she stepped out of line and showing every husband that the law supported his absolute authority. The blacksmith removed the glowing iron from the forge, holding it carefully with heavy tongs. It was a simple rod about 6 in long and 1 inch wide with a flat end that had been carefully shaped into the letter A for adulteress. The shaping had been done the previous day while Marjorie sat in a cell beneath the manor house listening to the sound of metal being hammered and knowing that iron was being prepared to mark her flesh permanently. Marjorie could feel the heat radiating from the metal as the blacksmith approached her, the rod glowing bright orange, waves of heat distorting the air around it. She tried to back away, an instinctive recoil from the approaching agony, but 2 men stepped forward and grabbed her arms, holding her firmly in place. One of them was her own cousin, a man she had known her entire life, but his face showed no sympathy, no doubt, only a grim determination to do his duty as a member of the community enforcing justice. The blacksmith positioned himself directly in front of Marjorie. He looked into her eyes for just a moment. Was that pity, apology, or simply the cold efficiency of a craftsman about to perform a task? Then pressed the glowing iron against Marjorie's left cheek. The sizzle of burning flesh was audible across the entire square, a sound like meat being seared on a hot pan, sharp and stomach-turning. Marjorie screamed, a sound of such pure, undiluted agony that it seemed to come from somewhere deeper than her throat, torn from her very soul. The scream echoed off the buildings surrounding the square, bouncing back and forth, filling the air with the sound of her suffering. The smell of burning flesh and hair filled the air, acrid and nauseating, making several people in the crowd turn away or cover their noses. But most watched with grim fascination, their faces showing a mixture of righteous satisfaction, vicarious horror, and perhaps relief that they were standing in the crowd rather than being held at the center of it. The blacksmith held the iron in place for several seconds that must have felt like hours to